History isn't a straight line. It's a jagged, blood-soaked path carved by men who refuse to blink. We like to think the world we live in, the languages we speak, the borders we draw, the gods we pray to, was inevitable. But it wasn't. Our entire civilization is the result of a few chaotic afternoons where thousands of men stood in the mud, clutched their spears, and prayed they wouldn't be the ones to feed the crows. If a single arrow had flown 6 inches to the left at Hastings, if a sudden rainstorm hadn't turned the French soil into a graveyard at Agincourt, if a Frankish leader named the Hammer hadn't stood his ground against an unstoppable empire, you wouldn't be watching this video right now. At least, not in the world you recognize. Welcome to Medieval Crazy History. Today, we aren't just looking at dates in a textbook. We are stepping into the carnage. We are analyzing the 6 pivotal moments where the Middle Ages were forged in fire. These are the battles that didn't just change history. They created your world. Grab your armor. Let's head to the front lines. The year is 732. The place is a nondescript stretch of road between the cities of Tours and Poitiers in what we now call France. But back then, France didn't exist. Civilized Europe was a fractured shell of its former Roman self, a collection of bickering tribes shivering in the shadow of a fallen empire. Meanwhile, from the south, an unstoppable juggernaut was screaming across the horizon. The Umayyad Caliphate was the superpower of the age. They had already swallowed North Africa, crushed the Visigoths in Spain, and crossed the Pyrenees with a singular, terrifying momentum. Their goal wasn't just a raid, it was the total expansion of the Islamic Empire into the heart of the European continent. Standing in their way was a man whose name would become a legend of sheer, brutal force, Charles Martel. But Martel wasn't his last name, it was a title. It means the hammer. And on this October morning, the hammer was about to meet the anvil. The Umayyad army, led by Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, was a sight that would have frozen the blood of any ordinary man. They were masters of the desert, a high-speed light cavalry force that moved like a wildfire. They had thousands of elite horsemen who had never known the taste of a true defeat. On the other side stood Charles and his Franks. They had no heavy cavalry. They had no professional standing army in the way we think of it today. They were mostly infantry, tough, grim men standing shoulder to shoulder in a dense, wooden-shielded square. Now you have to understand the crazy factor here. In the early Middle Ages, an infantry square successfully defending against a massive cavalry charge was considered a suicidal impossibility. It was like trying to stop a freight train with a human wall. But Charles Martel knew something his enemies didn't. He chose the ground perfectly. He positioned his men on a wooded hill, forcing the Muslim cavalry to charge uphill through trees that broke their formation. For 7 days, the two armies stared each other down. Smaller skirmishes broke out, but the main event waited for the Umayyads to lose their patience. Finally, the Caliphate's cavalry charged. They hit the Frankish line with the force of a tidal wave, but the Franks held. Contemporary chroniclers described the Frankish line as a wall of ice or a belt of steel. They stood their ground as the horses crashed into their shields, hacking at the legs of the mounts and the riders above them. Then, the turning point. Charles had sent scouts to the Umayyad camp to stir up chaos. Rumors spread among the Muslim ranks that their vast booty, the gold and treasures they had looted from other cities, was being stolen. Panic set in. Parts of the cavalry began to break off to head back and protect their spoils. To the rest of the army, it looked like a full-scale retreat. In the chaos, Abdul Rahman tried to rally his men, but he was surrounded and cut down by Frankish axes. When the sun rose the next day, the Frankish camp prepared for another assault. But the Umayyad tents were silent. The great army had vanished into the night, retreating back toward the south. Historians still debate the scale of Tours, but the consequence is undeniable. If Charles Martel had failed, there would have been no Charlemagne. There would have been no Holy Roman Empire. The trajectory of Western Christianity would have been severed at the root. Charles the Hammer. Martel didn't just win a battle, he hammered out the first rough shape of what we now call Europe. He proved that a disciplined, determined defense could break the greatest empire on earth. And in doing so, he ensured that the Middle Ages would be a story written in the Latin alphabet, not the Arabic one. If the Battle of Tours saved the soul of Europe, the year 1066 gave England its identity, but it did so through a sequence of events so improbable and violent that it feels like a fever dream. This is the story of the Battle of Hastings, a day where three different cultures collided to decide who would own the most valuable real estate in the north, the English throne. By the autumn of 1066, the English king Edward the Confessor was dead, and he hadn't left an heir. This triggered a three-way royal rumble. In the red corner, you had Harold Godwinson, the elected English king. In the blue corner, Harold Hardrada, a legendary Viking giant who believed the throne was his by right of conquest. And in the gold corner, William, the Duke of Normandy, a man history would eventually call the Conquistador, but who was then known by the much less flattering title of William the Bastard. The crazy part of this story starts with the timing. King Harold Godwinson had just marched his army 200 miles north in 4 days to crush the Viking invasion at Stamford Bridge. It was a stunning victory, but as his men were literally still washing the Viking blood off their swords, news arrived. William of Normandy had landed his fleet in the south. Harold's exhausted army had to turn around and march all the way back down. It was an athletic feat that should have been impossible, but by October 14th, the English were standing on Senlac Hill, forming a massive, terrifying shield wall. The Normans were different. While the English fought on foot with massive Dane axes that could split a horse in two, the Normans brought the future of warfare, heavy cavalry and organized archers. But as the battle began, the future looked like it was going to lose. For hours, the Norman knights charged up the hill, and for hours, they were butchered against the English shields. The hill became a slippery slaughterhouse of mud and gore. Then came the moment that changed the world. A rumor swept through the Norman ranks like a wildfire. "The Duke is dead! William has fallen!" The Norman line began to shatter. Men started to flee. But William wasn't dead. In one of the most iconic main character moves in history, he tore off his iron helmet so his men could see his face. He screamed above the roar of the slaughter, "Look at me, I am alive, and with God's help, I will conquer." He turned the retreat into a trap. As the English broke their formation to chase the fleeing Normans down the hill, they lost their only advantage, the shield wall. The Norman cavalry wheeled around and cut the disorganized English to pieces. In the chaos, King Harold was struck. Legend says an arrow pierced his eye. Others say he was hacked apart by 4 knights. Regardless of the method, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England was dead. The impact of Hastings cannot be overstated. Overnight, the English ruling class was wiped out and replaced by French-speaking Normans. This is why, today, the English language is such a strange, beautiful mess. We use Germanic words for the farm, cow, sheep, pig, and French words for the dinner table, beef, mutton, pork. William the Conqueror didn't just win a crown. He dragged England out of the Viking Age and tethered it to the politics and culture of continental Europe. If William had fallen on that hill, England might have remained a northern Scandinavian-focused backwater. Instead, it became a centralized powerhouse that would one day build the largest empire the world has ever seen. The modern world was born on a bloody hill in East Sussex, fueled by the ambition of a man who refused to be called a bastard any longer. While the West was being reshaped by Norman steel, the East was about to witness a cataclysm that would shift the center of gravity for the entire world. The year is 1071, and we are at Manzikert, in the rugged highlands of what is now eastern Turkey. This isn't just a battle, it is the beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire, the direct successor to ancient Rome, and the moment the gates of the Middle East were kicked wide open. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had been the golden shield of Christendom, a sophisticated superpower of marble cities and professional legions. But they were facing a new kind of nightmare, the Seljuk Turks. These weren't just soldiers, they were horse archers from the steppes who moved like shadows and struck like lightning. Their leader, Alp Arslan, the heroic lion, wasn't even interested in conquering Byzantium at first. He was focused on Fatimid Egypt. But the Byzantine emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, decided he was going to end the Turkish threat once and for all. Romanos marched out with a massive, glittering army of nearly 40,000 men. It was a multinational force of Franks, Normans, Bulgarians, and even Turkic mercenaries. On paper, they were invincible. But the crazy reality of Manzikert was that the Byzantine army was a house of cards built on betrayal. As the two forces met, the Seljuks used their classic nomadic tactics. They refused a direct confrontation, instead circling the Byzantine heavy infantry, peppering them with thousands of arrows, and retreating the moment the Romans charged. It was a psychological meat grinder. By late afternoon, Romanos realized his troops were exhausted and ordered a tactical withdrawal to their camp. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. One of Romanos's own generals, a political rival named Andronikos Doukas, saw his chance to seize power. Instead of covering the emperor's retreat, Doukas spread a lie to the reserve troops. "The emperor has been defeated. All is lost." He then turned his back and marched his segment of the army off the field, leaving Romanos and the center of the line completely abandoned in the middle of a swirling dust storm of Turkish arrows. The slaughter was absolute. For the first time in history, a Roman emperor was captured alive by a barbarian force. When Romanos was brought before Alp Arslan, the Sultan asked him what he would do if their positions were reversed. Romanos bitterly replied, "Perhaps I would kill you or exhibit you in the streets of Constantinople." Alp Arslan smiled and gave a response that defines medieval chivalry. "My punishment is far heavier. I forgive you and set you free." But the damage was done. Manzikert wasn't just a lost battle, it was a total collapse. With the Byzantine army destroyed, the heartland of Anatolia, the empire's main source of grain and soldiers, was left wide open. The Turks poured in, and within a few decades, what was once Rome became the foundation of the Turkish world. The ripples of this defeat reached all the way to the Vatican. Desperate and broken, the Byzantines sent a cry for help to the Pope in Rome. This single letter, born from the disaster at Manzikert, became the spark that ignited the Crusades. If the Byzantines had held their line at Manzikert, the Crusades might never have happened, and the modern map of the Middle East would be unrecognizable. The Lion of the Steppes had broken the shield of Rome, and the world would never be the same again. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the chaos that built our world, take a second to join the ranks of the medieval crazy history community. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a moment of historical madness. If you're watching us on your TV right now, it's easier than ever. Just point your smartphone camera at the QR code on the screen to subscribe instantly. And if you're watching on your phone, help us out by giving this video some hype. Drop a comment, share it with a friend, and let the algorithm know that history deserves to be heard. Now, let's head back to the heat of the desert for the battle that broke the Crusader states. The year is 1187, and the air in the Levant is thick with the scent of dry grass and impending doom. We are at the horns of Hattin, a twin-peaked volcanic hill overlooking the Sea of Galilee. This is the climax of the Crusades, a showdown between two of history's most iconic figures, the brilliant, unifying Sultan Saladin and the desperate, fractured leadership of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. To understand the crazy factor of Hattin, you have to understand the sheer stupidity of the Crusader leadership. They were led by King Guy de Lusignan, a man who allowed himself to be talked into a suicide march. Against the advice of his most seasoned commanders, Guy ordered his army of 20,000 men to leave the safety of the springs at Sephoria and march across a barren, waterless plateau in the middle of a scorching July heat wave. Their destination? The besieged city of Tiberias. Saladin couldn't believe his luck. He didn't need to charge the Crusaders, he just needed to wait for the sun to do the work. As the knights stumbled across the desert in their heavy iron mail, the heat reached over 100 degrees. Saladin's light cavalry swarmed them like hornets, cutting off any access to the nearby Sea of Galilee. The Crusaders were so close to the water they could see it shimmering in the distance, but they were trapped in a ring of fire, literally. As night fell, Saladin's men set fire to the dry scrub and grass surrounding the Crusader camp. The wind blew the thick, acrid smoke directly into the faces of the parched Christian soldiers. Throughout the night, Saladin's archers showered the camp with thousands of arrows. while his men chanted and beat drums, ensuring the Crusaders couldn't get a single second of sleep. By morning, the Crusader army was a ghost of itself. Men were collapsing from heatstroke and thirst so severe their tongues blackened in their mouths. The infantry, driven mad by the heat, broke formation and bolted toward the water, only to be slaughtered by the thousands. The knights made a desperate final stand on the horns of Hattin, surrounding the true cross, the holiest relic in Christendom, which they believed would grant them a miracle. There was no miracle. The relic was captured, and the elite of the Crusader states were either killed or taken prisoner. King Guy was captured, but Saladin, ever the chivalrous victor, offered him a bowl of rose water iced with snow from the mountains. When Guy passed the bowl to the treacherous Reynaud of Châtillon, Saladin intervened. He executed Reynaud on the spot for his past atrocities, but spared the king. The Battle of Hattin was the big bang for the collapse of the Crusader states. Within months, Saladin marched on Jerusalem, and the city that had been held by the Franks for nearly a century fell back into Muslim hands. This loss sent a shockwave through Europe that triggered the Third Crusade and the legendary rivalry between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. Hattin proved that religious zeal was no match for tactical genius and the brutal reality of logistics. It reshaped the Middle East, ending the dream of a permanent Crusader empire and cementing Saladin's legacy as one of the greatest commanders to ever live. The map of the Holy Land was redrawn in the ashes of the Galilean hills. The year is 1214. We are in the muddy fields of Flanders, near the small village of Bouvines. While this battle might not have the Hollywood fame of Hastings or Agincourt, it is arguably the most important political event of the 13th century. This was the first truly international European war, a massive, high-stakes gamble that would decide the fate of three empires and birth the concept of modern nation-states. On one side stood King Philip II of France, known as Philip Augustus. On the other, a massive super-coalition designed to wipe France off the map. This alliance was led by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, supported by the English King John, better known as the villainous Prince John from the Robin Hood legends, and several powerful rebel counts. The plan was simple, a pincer movement to crush the French monarchy once and for all. The crazy reality of Bouvines is that it happened on a Sunday. In the 13th century, fighting on a Sunday was a massive religious taboo, a violation of the truce of God. Philip Augustus actually tried to avoid the battle out of piety, but the coalition, sensing a moment of French vulnerability, pressed the attack anyway. The battle was a brutal, swirling melee of armored knights. At one point, the crazy history factor reached a fever pitch when King Philip himself was pulled from his horse by Flemish foot soldiers using iron hooks. He was pinned to the ground, with daggers searching for the gaps in his armor. It was only the incredible quality of his royal mail and the desperate intervention of his personal bodyguard that saved his life. On the other side, Emperor Otto IV had his horse killed under him and barely escaped the field, losing his imperial standard, a golden eagle, to the French. By the end of the day, the invincible coalition was shattered, but it's the aftermath that really matters. Because Philip Augustus won, France was consolidated into a powerful, centralized kingdom, laying the foundation for the French nation. But the ripple effect in England was even more dramatic. King John had spent a fortune of his barons' money to fund this war, and he had lost everything. When he slunk back to England in disgrace, his exhausted and angry nobles cornered him at Runnymede. Because of the defeat at Bouvines, John had no leverage left. He was forced to sign a document that limited the power of the king forever, the Magna Carta. If the French had lost at Bouvines, France might have been carved into pieces, and the Magna Carta, the foundation of modern democracy and the American legal system, might never have been written. One afternoon in the mud of Flanders ensured that the power of kings would have a limit and the identity of nations would be set in stone. One battle, two nations, and the birth of the rule of law. The year is 1415, and the high summer of the Middle Ages is fading into a cold, wet autumn. We are in northern France on a narrow strip of land between the woods of Tramecourt and Agincourt. This is the final act of our story, the Battle of Agincourt, a clash so lopsided and legendary that it has become the ultimate symbol of the underdog in military history. To set the crazy scene, the English army, led by King Henry V, was a starving, dysentery-ridden ghost of a force. They had been marching for weeks, trying to reach the safety of Calais. They were outnumbered at least 3-1, some chronicles say 5-1, by the cream of French nobility. The French had thousands of elite knights in state-of-the-art plate armor, fresh horses, and the absolute certainty that they were about to crush the goddams, as they called the English, once and for all. But Henry V had a secret weapon that would turn the age of chivalry into a slaughterhouse, the English longbow. The morning of October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, began with a heavy silence. The field between the two armies had been freshly ploughed and soaked by days of torrential rain. It was a knee-deep swamp of thick, sucking clay. The French, in their arrogance and desire for individual glory, crowded into a narrow space, shoulder to shoulder, their heavy armor weighing them down like lead suits. Then Henry gave the order. Thousands of English archers, men of low birth, many fighting in their tunics with no armor at all, stepped forward and drove sharpened wooden stakes into the ground. They drew back bows made of yew with a pull weight of 150 pounds and loosed. The sky went dark. Chroniclers describe the sound as a terrifying hiss like 1,000 snakes. This wasn't just a few arrows, it was a storm of iron. 6,000 archers, each firing 10 to 12 aimed shots per minute. That is roughly 70,000 arrows every 60 seconds raining down on the French. The crazy horror of Agincourt happened when the French tried to charge through the mud. The arrows didn't always pierce the plate armor, but they killed the horses and panicked the men. Knights fell in the mud and couldn't get back up under the weight of their steel. As the rear ranks pushed forward, they literally trampled their own front ranks into the slime. Men didn't just die from sword wounds. Hundreds of the most powerful nobles in Europe literally drowned in the mud, pinned down by the bodies of their own comrades. When the arrows ran out, the English archers dropped their bows, drew light hatchets and lead hammers, and ran into the chaos. They were light and mobile. The French knights were statues trapped in clay. It was a massacre. By the end of the day, the French army was annihilated. The flower of French chivalry lay dead in the dirt, killed not by other knights, but by commoners with wooden bows. Agincourt was the funeral of the medieval way of war. It proved that the expensive elite knight, the tank of the Middle Ages, was obsolete against disciplined long-range firepower. It shifted the power from the feudal lords to the centralized state that could afford to train and equip thousands of archers. More importantly, it cemented the English identity. For the first time, a King of England had led a national army to a miraculous victory against impossible odds. The echoes of Agincourt stayed with the British through the centuries, through 2 world wars, and into the very DNA of Western military thought. The era of the knight was over. The era of the professional soldier had begun. In the mud of Agincourt, the Middle Ages didn't just end, they were executed. 6 battles. 6 afternoons where the winds of fate blew across the fields of Europe and the deserts of the East. When we look back at the Middle Ages, it's easy to see them as a static era of stone castles and stagnant lives. But as we've seen today, that couldn't be further from the truth. The medieval world was a volatile, high-stakes game of survival, where a single decision, a tactical retreat at Tours, a helmet lifted at Hastings, or a thirsty march at Hattin, could echo for 1,000 years. These weren't just clashes of steel, they were clashes of ideas. At Tours and Manzikert, the very borders of civilizations were drawn. At Hastings and Bouvines, the modern nations of England and France were forged in blood and bureaucracy. At Hattin, the religious map of the world was shattered and rebuilt. And at Agincourt, the knight, the ultimate symbol of the medieval elite, was finally laid to rest by the common man. History is a chaotic, unpredictable beast. It is written by the bold, the desperate, and sometimes the just plain lucky. The world you walk through today, the very air of the 21st century, is still vibrating with the shockwaves of these 6 explosions. We are the sons and daughters of the survivors of these battlefields. Their courage, their brilliance, and even their crazy mistakes are the reason we are here today. The Middle Ages were long, they were brutal, and they were undeniably insane. But without that madness, the modern world would be a blank page. These 6 battles didn't just end an era, they started ours. History isn't just in the past, it's the foundation beneath your feet. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never forget that a single arrow can change everything.